Hello, everyone. So, my presentation for today is going to be based around understanding race and caste in the United States. So, the things we will discuss today are specifically the definition and the concept of race in the United States and how it's been used in U.S. history. And we'll also be looking at the intersections of race and caste and also how class fits into this as well. So, the first thing I like to do in order to show how race and racial classifications are created in the US is to do this little exercise where I present four different people and we try to figure out why exactly certain individuals are categorized in one race and why certain individuals are categorized as a different race. So, as we can see at the very top, you have two individuals, Andrew Yang and Aziz Ansari. Now, if we look at the racial classifications based on the US Census, you can see that both these men over here, they would be classified as Asian. But what is the reason for them both being classified Asian? And then if we look at the two men at the bottom, you'll see John Stamos and Clay Thompson. Now, many people, if they don't know who Clay Thompson is, they would guess that he is a white American or that he's not somebody who is black. But based on the racial classifications in the US, he is classified as a black man because his father is black. In the US, we have this historical rule where if anybody has any black ancestry, they're automatically classified as black. And then you have John Stamos. You can see in terms of skin tone, you can say that his skin tone is perhaps even darker than Clay Thompson's, but he is classified as a white man. So, where do we go from here? Well, now we have to understand why these specific racial classifications are the way they are in the US. So, in order for us to do this, we first have to define and categorize what race means. And this can be a little bit complicated because everybody has slightly different definitions of what race is. But ultimately, what we will see is that race is something that's socially constructed, it is not something that is biological. So, race, in many ways, is categorizing humans based on shared physical, social qualities that are thought to be distinct in a given society. So Isabel Wilkerson, she is an author who has written multiple books. She's recently published this book called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. And she defines race as the physical traits for who a person is. But next, we can see a more complex definition where we see that race includes a person's name, their ethnic and historical origins, their first spoken language, their religion, their culture, and also the geographical location of their place of birth. So for those reasons, that's why you have somebody like Aziz Ansari and Andrew Yang being classified as part of the same race because they're both thought to have ancestry that comes from Asia. Therefore, they are Asian, even though their phenotypical features don't really match each other in any way. So the next thing we get to is whether or not race is something that's fixed or fluid. And by fluid, I mean is this something that's changing throughout history. Now, as I said before, race is and always was a social construct. It has always been this system created by those in power, those with privilege, to define which groups can access these privileges and which ones can't. So you can see in both colonial and domestic societies, you have these types of things. So even in societies like British colonization of India, they also had their own racial classifications, and in many ways, you can see in both these societies, even the US, to some extent, people like Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, he's an African American intellectual. He also talks about how the US, in many ways, the experience of African Americans is quite similar to being a colonized subject as part of the British Empire. In many ways, you don't get the same rights as an actual citizen. So, specifically in the US, the definitions of who's white and who isn't has been constantly modified and changed. And I would like to show this by using Indian immigrants as a case study for this. So, more importantly, one thing that we do need to recognize is that these definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. So, in many ways, the terms black, white, Indian, these types of things, these are terms that did not come from the indigenous people themselves. They were actually definitions created by others. So, for example, with Native Americans in the US, they were called Indians, even though they aren't from India. And even the term India comes from classical Latin and is derived from the Greek language. And even terms like Africa, those are also Latin terms. So therefore, these terms like African, Asian, these are already Europeanized terms for defining these people. And caste, which I will talk about later, that's also this anglicized Portuguese term from casta, which means lineage. So in India, they didn't really call their system a caste system; they called it a Varna system. But then when the Portuguese first go there, they start describing this as a caste system. They use their term casta, which means lineage, to describe how privileges were structured in Indian society. So now the next thing, and this is quite an interesting concept because the term Caucasian, it means very different things in different contexts. So in the US, generally when we think about the term Caucasian, it usually means anyone who is white or has ancestry from Europe. But the term Caucasian, at least in the anthropological sense, it really means anybody who traces their ancestry to the Caucasus Mountains, which is a region between the Black and the Caspian Seas. So as you can see on this map I have over here, you can see which modern countries make up this land. So it's the southern part of Russia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, also a little bit of northern Iran. So that's really where the term Caucasian comes from, is the Caucasus Mountains. And it is believed that both the people of Western Europe and northern India trace their ancestry to the people who used to inhabit these lands. However, as I said before, in the modern day US, this term has become interchangeable with white. But nowadays, in addition to white Europeans and white Americans, immigrants from the Middle East, Northern Africa, they're also considered to be white and Caucasian by the U.S. Census in contemporary America. So you can see how these classifications in the census, they change, and how race is always this changing concept. So you could have been one race back in the 1800s, but suddenly in the 1900s you're a different race, and then now you could be a different race. So it shows how race is constantly being changed throughout American history. Now, this change is quite important because when Indian immigrants first came to the US, they used to argue that they were Caucasian, therefore they're white, they're able to get citizenship. Now, the Chinese immigrants, they were already excluded based on the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. This prevented Chinese immigration. However, this did not apply to North Indians, especially fair-skinned North Indians. They were able to come to the US and gain citizenship if they could speak English under the Naturalization Act of 1906. Now, a lot of this stems from the Constitution itself, where you had the original Naturalization Act, where they say that anybody who is a free white person of good character is eligible for citizenship. However, they don't define what they mean by free white persons. So, in many ways, when Indians, especially Hindus, they start coming to the US, a lot of immigration officials, they don't know how to classify them because there's not a specific definition of who is white and who isn't. So this leads us to the question, who is white? So because there was this lack of classifications of what a free white person is and what a free white person isn't, during the first couple decades of the 20th century, we had several Indians who were able to get citizenship based on this idea because they were able to categorize themselves as free white persons. Now, Balsara in particular, he was categorized as white since he was Caucasian, which, as I said before, from the anthropological sense, it means somebody with an ethnic group whose ancestry was rooted in the Caucasus Mountains between the Black and Caspian Seas, which Indians would trace their ancestry to. So now ultimately this whole thing comes to fruition and ends up reaching the Supreme Court with this man named Bhagat Singh Thind. So Thind, he comes to Seattle in 1913. He serves in the U.S. Army during World War I. And so in 1919, he tries to get a citizenship, and he is able to get citizenship in Oregon. However, individual states don't grant citizenship. It is the federal government. So the Bureau of Naturalization, they tried to block his citizenship, and then the case gets sent to the Supreme Court. Now, when Thind presents his case in front of the Supreme Court, he argues that he is Caucasian, and therefore he should be eligible for citizenship. And this term Caucasian, it refers to Indo-Iranians as well, that they're also part of this Caucasian race. However, the U.S. Supreme Court, they end up saying that Thind is not a Caucasian in the way Americans see it, because Caucasians in the U.S. are predominantly seen as white Europeans, and because of that, they would not grant him citizenship. And the argument they make is that the Supreme Court argues that the common American would not see somebody from Asia as being white. So even though technically this person is Caucasian in the anthropological sense, the way we use this term in the US would not classify this person as being white and Caucasian. The term Caucasian in the US specifically means a white person and a white immigrant from Europe. So ultimately, because of this, Thind is not able to get citizenship. But the interesting thing to note is that within the Supreme Court case itself, the arguments in the racial science they use is actually from the British, and the British actually classified people from Thind's village in India as being white people. So it shows how sometimes the US might not see a certain group as being white, but the British will. And it really shows just how subjective these terms are, how they're really constructed socially. There's no real biological evidence between how racial classifications are made in the US. So this is just a short video. I won't play this since we don't have too much time, but she also just talks about the end result of this Thind case, which shows that Indians, even though they are Caucasian, aren't classified as white based on the US Census. So it shows this type of issue within how the US classifies race, and it shows that they're using their own subjective terminology for this rather than following the anthropological term of what Caucasian means. So now we get to the aftermath of the Thind case. And so this case actually ends up being quite monumental. Many non-white immigrants are stripped of citizenship. Now, after World War II, some attitudes tend to shift because India and also many other countries in Asia, they ended up helping out the Allies during World War II. So as a result of this, you have this Luceller Act of 1946, which shows up, but it only allows 100 Indians a year to immigrate, and it also includes 100 Filipinos within this. But the decisions only truly fully reversed after the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which makes racialized types of immigration policies discriminating against certain immigrants illegal based on the Civil Rights Act. So this really shows how the U.S. Civil Rights Act actually ended up having a massive impact for non-white immigrants in the U.S. too. And it's not just a movement that's specifically an African-American rights type of movement. It really encapsulates the needs of all groups. This includes women, this includes immigrants. So they're also able to massively benefit from the Civil Rights Act, which really makes these older policies such as the Thind case null and void because it no longer allows these types of racialized legal types of discrimination, which ends up getting reversed. So now we try to look at race as a system of castes. Now, caste, the definition of caste is a system of social differentiation, which is widely understood based on birth and hereditary customs and habits. So this enforces a fixed lifestyle where an individual can only have specific occupations, they have this fixed status in a hierarchy, and they can only interact and have social interactions, marry within certain groups. Now, in the US, although caste was never really a central theme to the anti-slavery movement, many anti-slavery activists did use the term caste to describe the institution. So people like Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, they used this term, and they really used this term caste to really show that if you really got rid of racialized based discrimination, then you could try to deal with other forms of inequities in American society, which are class-based as well. But you can see other examples as well during the Civil War, where Louisiana Creoles, they also talked about caste in the U.S. And interesting enough, during the Civil War, when towards the end of the Civil War in 1864, Louisiana-based lawmakers, they were going to make Creoles who had more than 75% African American or white American ancestry, they would now be classified as white. So it really showed how this group that wasn't classified as white before could now be classified as it. But Creoles ultimately turned down that opportunity. They thought that this would just create another caste system and create this third caste of Creoles in between African Americans and white Americans. So you can see in many ways how these racialized classifications really constitute a system of caste as well. And the most impactful Supreme Court case when it comes to this was the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, a case which ruled that Jim Crow segregation was legal in the U.S. But there was this one dissenter, Justice John Marshall Harlan, and he argued that race-based administration constitutes a caste-based society. And he argues specifically in his written decision, he says that there is no caste in the US. By implementing this, we are basically creating a caste system. So you can see in many ways how these ideas of caste and race are intertwining with one another.